Welcome, scholars, to another United States history lecture. This time we're actually going to get into the Civil War. Not just have a decade of crisis that leads to the war, but figure out what causes the war itself to spark in 1860. The target that we'll be examining for your target sheet is 4.02. When you look at the coming of the Civil War, there are clearly a lot of things that lead up to it. A lot of agitation over the issue of slavery, westward expansion, a whole decade of crisis. But in the immediate, the sort of quick, short term, you have to look at the election of 1860. It's a really divided election. It's divided because there are four candidates. Candidate number one, Abraham Lincoln, representing the new Republican Party. Remember, they're only 6 years old at this point, formed in 1854. So good old honest Abe stands on a platform of no slavery in the territories. That's right. As America expands west, there should be no slavery in those territories. Leave them open to ordinary, non-human being owning folks to go west and make their fortunes. Our second candidate is Stephen Douglas. And Stephen Douglas is a Democrat. He is the architect of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He is a Northerner, though, so he's got roots in the North. He's done some things that make Southerners happy. And his platform, with the rest of the Democrats, is that Congress would not interfere with slavery in the territories. That's a very wishy-washy way of saying popular sovereignty and Congress will remain hands-off. So if slavery pops up in the West, then it pops up in the West, and Congress will stay out of that issue. So it's a little bit of weak sauce, and Southerners particularly don't like it because they think it's not strong enough. So the Democrats actually split, and they form a new faction called the Southern Democrats. The Southern Democrats are led by this guy who does not look like he would be fun at parties. His name is John C. Breckinridge. Yeah, he definitely looks like a Buzz Killington. So here's the difference between Democrats and Southern Democrats. Democrats are very wishy-washy. Let slavery happen. If it happens, Congress will stay out. The Southern Democrats actually want federal protection of slavery in the territories. They want the federal government involved. Instead of being hands-off, they want the United States government to be hands-on and actually protect slavery in the West, protect those Southern property rights. Our last candidate, because I said there were four, is a man named John L. Bell, who stands for the Constitutional Union Party. And I like to call them the Can't We All Just Get Along Party. And he does not also look like a fun kind of guy. He looks like he could make milk sour with his face. The platform of constitutional union is, please, let's not destroy our country over this. Let's compromise. Let's save our union. Let's just hug and, deal with this and not tear our nation apart. So our four candidates, one who says no slavery in the West, one who says if it happens, it happens. Another said no, the federal government must protect slavery in the West. And our last one saying, can't we just hug each other and stop fighting? What would you predict would happen in an election with four major candidates for president. If you said the election results would be split, you would be right. With 4 choices, it's going to split the vote more than it would if we were looking at just 2 choices or even 3 choices. So here's a map of the vote as it falls out. Republicans very clearly in the north. So this pinky salmony color, north, 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 north. That's pretty predictable. Southern Democrats, we must have slavery everywhere and protect it. Clearly the South. Not really a surprise there. In the middle is where you can see that there is definitely some kind of, we're not sure where to go. Like, for example, Bell does well in Virginia, which you would expect to go for Southern Democrat. But many Virginians apparently want to compromise and save the Union. They are, after all, next door to the North. So is Kentucky, even Tennessee. And Douglas, who is from the North, only wins 1 northern state. And not his home state, in fact. So northern states, Republican, southern states, Democrat, and the middle is where we see more of the, we're not sure which way to go. And as you can look at the bottom of the map and see the vote totals, look at the split. Lincoln got 40% of the popular vote. Douglas got 29% of the popular vote. The other 2 got 18 and 13. But as we all know, the popular vote doesn't determine the president. It's the electoral vote. And that's where Lincoln came out ahead with 59% of the electoral vote. Now, I want you to consider this. How do you elect a man to be president who doesn't even get a majority of the nation's vote, right? 40%. And whose name does not even appear on Southern ballots? Lincoln's name doesn't even show up down here. So Southerners don't even know, well, can't really even vote for him. I mean, they know who he is, but they don't really have a choice. And of course, they're not going to choose to vote for him anyway, because if your neighbors ever found out, boy, you'd be done for in the South. How are you going to have a nation that is that split in half, being led by a man that half of the country, more than half the country, did not elect? Well, now that Lincoln is president, South Carolina is going to be the first state to say, we out. That happens in December of 1860. They decide that they no longer want to be part of the United States, and so they leave the Union because Lincoln wins the election. Lincoln hasn't even done anything. He's not even in office yet, and South Carolina is saying, it doesn't matter. We don't trust him. And here's why they don't trust him. They argue that he's a black Republican. I didn't make up that phrasing. They made up that phrasing, black, to link him to African Americans. So they believe that he is going to end slavery. He's going to try to undo their economic and social system that they've lived with since the beginning. So they say you can't trust him. You can't let him lead the nation because he will try to end slavery, which is a position that Lincoln never argued and never said. So South Carolina is going out on a limb. They're leaving the country. Can they do that? Is that legal? Is that constitutional? Generally, scholars, legal scholars, constitutional scholars say no. South Carolina tried to make the argument that they had formed the Union, states had come together and made the United States, and that states could leave it if they wanted. Except the problem with that is that a single state can't just up and decide to break this Union contract. That's not how contracts work. You can't enter in a contract with someone and then just decide on your own to break it. all the people in that contract need to break it. And that's why scholars have argued generally since then that secession is not legal. That in fact, what South Carolina is doing is a rebellion. This is a rebellion against the legitimate government. And we've had some debate about that more recently. If you paid attention to the news about Confederate monuments, many of which weren't even set up in the aftermath of the Civil War, but much later, a lot of folks are saying, why do we have monuments up to traitors, to people who lost a war and were traitors to the United States? So keep in mind that, generally speaking, secession's not considered to be a legal doctrine. But South Carolina didn't care. They don't like Lincoln, and they're leaving. Lincoln's response is the Union is permanent. It cannot be broken by a single state. When the United States was created, it was created by all of the states in a process. And one state just can't simply say that it is done and it's walking out. So Lincoln believes that this is a rebellion, that it is illegal. And now we have to see, will there be a war? What will happen next? Of course, you and I know the answer to that question. Lincoln didn't. There will be a war, a bloody, devastating war lasting until 1865, which will result in the deaths of 720,000 Americans. Let's look at secession, how it unfolded. South Carolina is number 1, December of 1860. 2 is actually Mississippi, followed by Florida, then by Alabama, then by Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and last, slow and steady wins the race, North Carolina. So the map shows you that the first states to go to reject Lincoln are the most southern of the states. And the last states to leave are the most northern states. They're the ones closest to the north. Can you think of why that might be? Is it possible that these northern states, being closer to the north, have more ties to the north? That it's a bigger deal for them to leave because they're closer to the northern states? You can also see from the map that there are states that are on the border between the North and the South that don't leave the Union. Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. These border states also have slavery. In fact, there are about 400,000 enslaved people in those 4 states. But they remain in the Union. How awkward for them. How awkward for anyone to be on the border of the Civil War. We'll see more about that in a future lecture. South Carolina and the rest of the southern states form a confederacy, but the war won't start until April of 1861. Up until then, it was sort of like a waiting game to see if violence is going to break out. Will the South just be allowed to go? Will the North try to stop them? We're not really sure. So it's kind of a waiting game. Think about how long that is. December of 1860 to April of 1861. That's a long time to wait to figure out what's going to happen. Though we also should point out, too, Lincoln is not president until March of 1861, because that's how long it takes at this time before you install a new president, you inaugurate a new president. Lincoln decided that the South would not be allowed to rebel, that it was illegal, it was unconstitutional. And he also decided that federal forts in the South would remain in federal hands. They belonged to the federal government. So one of those forts was in Charleston, South Carolina, Fort Sumter. And Lincoln said that he was going to continue to resupply the fort, send it supplies, and that it was going to remain part of the United States. South Carolinians refused. Of course, if you are trying to rebel and create your own country, you don't want in the middle of your own country a foreign power to own a fort, especially if they're potential enemies of yours. And so this situation resulted in finally a shooting match. South Carolina takes Fort Sumter, and now the war is on. So shots were fired, and the war begins. Lincoln asked for the rest of the South, like North Carolina, Virginia, so on, to send troops to put down the rebellion. Notice he calls it a rebellion because he doesn't think it's constitutional or legal. So he asks for the rest of the South to contribute these troops, and they say no. Because I imagine it would be awkward for a southern state to suddenly turn around and shoot other southern states, shoot your sort of brethren there. And this call for troops pushes the rest of those southern states to join with the Confederacy. May of 1861, all of the 11 states of the South form a confederacy under President Jefferson Davis. They had organized an earlier Confederate grouping in February before with just the first states that seceded. But now that every southern state is out, they form a government. They are actually rebels now in revolution against the United States. They do write a constitution. In many ways, it's plagiarized from the U.S. Constitution and the Articles of Confederation. I mean, if you turn it in, you would definitely get a similarity score that would get you in trouble. It is states' rights focused because they focus on that as a key part of who they are. And they directly write slavery into this Constitution. So slavery is a part of the founding of the Southern Confederacy. It is written into their government. Over time, historians have explored what caused the Civil War. How can we talk about this massive event that leads to so many deaths? And in many ways, the theories of the causes of the Civil War kind of work together, but historians over time have emphasized some more than others. I want to point out a few of them to you, of the most popular of the theories of the Civil War, starting with one of the oldest, sectionalism. This theory says that the North was an industrialized, free labor North, and it could not abide or deal with an agricultural, slave-based South. You've got two rival economies, and they're just going to clash. Of course, I would say to that, the problem with this is that those two economies were connected. It's not like Northerners didn't profit off of slavery, because they did actually profit off of slavery, and many Northerners were connected to the institution of slavery. So that's a problem with this theory. And it's also possible to say that two different economies don't necessarily have to go to war against each other just because they're different economies. We can also, though, look at sectionalism as an underlying cause, and that the Northerners and Southerners do see each other as different, and they do see their economic and social systems as superior. So there is something to be said for this theory. One explanation of the cause of the Civil War really took off in the 20th century, and it's I call it the blundering politicians theory. It basically says we were led in the United States by dumb politicians who weren't really interested in compromising. They were just interested in winning elections and beating their enemies, and that led them to, instead of working together, escalate and escalate and fight and fight and fight and fight and fight until it tore the country apart. I would say the problem with this theory is that it assumes that the politicians are the reason for the war, and maybe they are, but then again, there are real deep commitments to slavery in the South. It's not like it's just a political game that you're trying to win. They really do believe in it. One of the theories that has been in existence since the end of the war itself is the states' rights theory, in which it said that Southerners started this war because they didn't want the federal government taking away power from the states. I would say the problem with this theory is that it's too vague. States' rights had been an idea around long before this, and it didn't cause a civil war. And besides, states' rights to do what? I don't think you start a war without some real problem that you believe is being an issue that you could lose your rights over. So the federal government is not just vaguely taking power from the states. There has to be a real issue that they fight over in order to get to a war. And the last theory is the slavery theory. It is the reigning dominant theory. And it says that the North and the South are really fighting over the future of slavery. Will the country, will the United States be half slave and half free? What will be the legal and constitutional future of the ownership of human beings? And many historians today point out that if you took away slavery, you couldn't have gotten to a civil war. There wasn't anything in these other theories that would have driven the U.S. to such a devastating conflict if there hadn't been the institution of slavery, the idea that owning human beings was right and that it was socially good and that Southerners needed to protect that at all costs. So my personal one that I think that really helps understand the coming of the Civil War is the continuing fight over slavery from a legal, social, economic, and political point of view that helps create the Civil War that we have beginning in 1860 and 61.